Hello there, my name is Alex, I am the Mont, and this is my review of The Witcher 3 on PlayStation 4. Bit late, huh? Still, better late than never. I was waiting for the Game of the Year version with all DLCs to be included, and even then I forgot about it for a while. That said, I just finished the Blood and Wine expansion before writing this script, so now is as good a time as any to write this review. Of course, this review is not sponsored in any way, but that should be obvious at this point. My experience with The Witcher? I played the second game when it came out on the Xbox 360, I know, but I've never touched the first game or any of the books. I played the game in English, so let's get started. And I'm going to start this review off with the negatives, the things about Witcher 3 I did not enjoy or feel could be improved upon. Then we'll move on to the positive aspects. And here's the biggest issue I have with The Witcher 3, that which kept me from buying the game much sooner. The combat. Unfortunately, it can be hard to explain what makes a game's combat engine feel right, but for me it usually boils down to a few things. Attacks feeling like they have impact and weight behind them. Good hit detection and combat pacing add a lot to this as well. Whilst all three games have very different combat, I'm going to compare The Witcher 3 with Skyrim and Dark Souls, as those are three games I imagine most viewers will know or have some experience with. Let's put Skyrim at the bottom because the combat in that game is mindless, spammy, lacks any real depth or nuance. Don't bring up mods, I'm talking about the base game experience. Then let's put Dark Souls at the top. By no means am I saying Dark Souls has the best combat ever, because it doesn't, but there is some depth to it. Stats are important, but you can defeat the game at base level. You can dodge and block attacks. Said attacks typically feel like there is a good sense of force or momentum behind them. Then you have The Witcher 3, which is somewhere in the middle between Skyrim and Dark Souls. Combat can be spammy and unresponsive. Sometimes you will press a defensive action only for Geralt to not really do anything due to the way his animations play out. Attacks feel very floaty, in part due to the way Geralt spins about in his trademarked fighting style. However, there are execution style finishes which they do have some impact, and if you build your character in a certain way, you can make it so that you turn into a whirlwind of limb removal, which is fun. I think I see what they were going for, but I don't think they quite achieved it. The combat isn't fun for me, but at the same time, it rarely became such a chore that I hated it, so it was a middle ground between the Souls-style combat, which I enjoy, and the Skyrim-style combat, which I despise. And just on a brief tangent, yes, I know Skyrim has other things going for it, and no, I'm not saying Dark Souls is the best game ever with the best combat. But all three of them are action RPGs of around a similar time period. There's another problem with The Witcher's combat. Fighting in the game is effectively split into three categories, using your swords, using alchemy, and using magic. There are three ability trees that correspond to each of these styles. Now, let's say you wanted to be a big bruiser, focusing on melee damage. You would imagine that the ability tree called Combat, that focuses on melee damage and your swords, you would imagine that would be the one to go with, right? Wrong! For some reason, the alchemy tree does everything the melee tree does, but better. You effectively have signs, alchemy, and a trick tree. Yes, a trick tree that is largely worthless in comparison. Aside from that, the ability trees do feel somewhat balanced, but you're still playing to a set template. You can't exactly build Geralt and turn him into a mage. You will always be a Witcher, that is your class. You can just specialize or lean in a certain direction. So how could they improve it? Perhaps it's a little pointless to even discuss the matter at this point in time, given that The Witcher as a franchise seems done, but I'll go into it anyway. From my understanding, Witchers have superhuman strength and speed. They carry two swords but fight with one, leaving one hand free to cast signs, their unique form of magic, and presumably throw bombs or hold a torch and so forth. I feel the game currently places too much focus on simply hacking away endlessly until you finish a foe off. You just spam light attack forever. You use the same attacks on a human that you would use on a monster. Doesn't that seem a little silly? I would advocate towards the game using a stance system, akin to Jedi Outcast. a game that also has force powers that you can liken to signs. Or you could say Neo for the stance system. Or just a separate combat mechanic entirely between monsters and humans, almost akin to Dragon's Dogma. Personally, I feel the stance system would make a lot of sense. A high and slow stance to use against armoured enemies, knights, or monsters with thick shells and so forth. A low and fast stance to use against unarmoured enemies. And perhaps even a third stance to use against multiple enemies. 2 or 3 really depends on how much depth you want. But I feel this would be a great way to go about it. I also feel the game would strongly benefit from a combo system. For example, light attack, heavy attack, sign attack could result in Geralt quickly attacking twice whilst positioning himself behind an enemy, delivering a strong blow to their blind spot, and then the context-sensitive combo would end with him knocking the enemy away with the Ard sign. Swapping between signs on the fly should certainly stay to some extent, but I feel like a combo system would better implement them into the flow of combat. So you would have your sign button, but it would be context sensitive. So if you did light attack, sign attack, or heavy attack, sign attack, it would be a different sign depending on the context, right? I also feel like human enemies should be tweaked until they're closer to what you might find in Ninja Gaiden 2. A ninja in that game will do its damned best to kill you, but you'll also be able to remove its limbs in a moment. You'll be able to destroy the enemy in a second. There's a video in the description of some Ninja Gaiden combat which will probably give you an idea of what I'm speaking about. Of course, it doesn't need to be like that exactly, but I feel like it conveys the sense that Ryu from Ninja Gaiden, as described in-game, is a super ninja. He's not just a ninja, he's a super ninja. Geralt in The Witcher, rarely does he feel superhuman. Ignoring the fact that you fall like 5 feet and he dies, his speed, strength, superior senses, none of that really come across in the way the game portrays its combat. Yeah, there are cutscenes where he'll say like, I can hear your heart beating, or you use his senses to find things in, Batman detective mode. But in combat, the only real supernatural element to Geralt is, well, his magic, and sometimes the fact that he can chop someone in half with like a little wave of his hand. But that is just my opinion. At the end of the day, I think a cross between Ninja Gaiden and Jedi Outcast, signs are very close to force powers, would be a great way for combat to play out. Enemies should be dangerous, yes. Geralt is superhuman in that he is super strong, but he's not like super resistant to damage, so far as I'm aware. Enemies hitting you should really have an impact on Geralt, but they shouldn't be able to hit you because you're so fast and so deadly. You should be zipping between them, slicing them to ribbons before they get a chance. Again, Ninja Gaiden is a great reference for that. And the stance system would really help you feel as if you were actually fighting a monster in a different way than you're fighting a human. Right now, whether I'm fighting a human or a monster, whatever I'm fighting in The Witcher, irrespective of the difficulty setting, I could just spam light attack forever and basically win. And a stance system would help to relieve that problem. Fighting against armoured enemies, you should be aiming specifically for their weak points or to penetrate their armour. Fighting against someone without armour? Sure, just go ham. Turn yourself into a tornado. Well, that was a lot of talk about combat. Because that is honestly the biggest issue I have with The Witcher 3. Aside from that, near every part of the game is standout, exceptional, or at the very least above average. So, well, where to begin? Let's go with the story. The Witcher 3 has a story that manages to deliver freedom and urgency all at once, a rare feat in an open world game. Yes, a giant dragon is about to blow up the world, but there's plenty of time for you to go and find that village's lost donkey, don't worry about it. Sort of defeats any sense of urgency, doesn't it? The basic premise of The Witcher 3 is that Geralt, and I still have trouble pronouncing his name even though I've heard it like a million times now, Geralt is searching for Ciri, his adopted daughter, to put it in simple terms. In searching for her, Geralt funds his venture via taking on witcher's work, a witcher being effectively a monster hunter for hire, an expert in all things occult, monsters, curses and the like. His profession is highly sought after, although as a mutant, he faces, well, prejudice. Whilst there's nothing incredibly unique about the plot, there doesn't need to be. The plot is presented well to us. Geralt is not the chosen one, but Ciri is, thus giving The Witcher 3 the interesting notion of your actions shaping the chosen one in the final battle. Players might be tempted to shoulder every task themselves, or to better show faith in the independence of Ciri, a character who is clearly quite competent. The game handles this realistically, and I enjoyed it a lot. In particular, I enjoyed it because, 5-some years ago, I had the dream of making an open-world RPG, somewhere across between Elder Scrolls and Dark Souls, where you are not the chosen one, but you are guiding the chosen one, and the choices you make throughout the game would affect the ending. And that is almost exactly what the second half of Witcher 3 is, so it appealed to me on a very personal level because of that. But really, the main plot isn't where the story excels in Witcher 3. That would instead be in all the short stories to be found in the world. Dozens, if not hundreds of them. A man who hires the Witcher to find his lost wife and daughter, a contract on a werewolf, haunted ruins, and so forth. The Witcher 3 has just about the best side quests of any game I've played in recent history. Perhaps ever. When starting out, you'll quickly find that many simple contracts quickly turn into something far more interesting or dangerous. But eventually, you might discover to actually anticipate this. Did a rich man give you a contract to kill a banshee? 50 hours into the game, you'll probably be expecting the banshee to actually be his daughter who he killed with a horseshoe to the skull after she had relations with a stable hand. That's not actually in the game, so far as I'm aware, but you get my meaning. You will start to anticipate some twist or revelation, and the actual simple contracts that are just, go here, kill a monster, that's it. Those become the more surprising ones. They become the exception as opposed to the rule. It's not a bad place to be though, by any means. See, I call them side quests in that they are aside from the main quest, but side quest has so many negative connotations that it almost feels unfair to label them such. There is so much thought and care and polish, no pun intended, put into The Witcher 3 that it really does feel like a labour of love. Let me offer a few examples. Let's compare with, say, Skyrim or Mass Effect. A side quest conversation with an NPC. The NPC will feel like a throwaway character who serves no purpose beyond info dumping you. The cutscene in which you talk to them will probably use some stock face-to-face or over-the-shoulder angles that every cutscene uses. In The Witcher 3, not only does every NPC feel like a somewhat fleshed out character, but each cutscene feels handcrafted. It feels like there is as much effort put into an NPC who will show up for 5 minutes as an NPC who's going to be showing up 10 times, 100 times. The cutscenes feel handcrafted, not like they're just having stock camera angles. The cutscenes appear to be handled in the same way a movie might be, framing, even lighting taken into consideration, even though many cutscenes will differ depend on the time of day, obviously. With the touch there of someone who cares. You might argue, what does it matter? So long as you get the information you need from the cutscene, who cares about the angles? That would be a very stupid argument to make though. The framing of a shot matters as much as the inflection in a voice, the context of music. It all combines to play on the emotions of the viewer or player. And just about every cutscene in The Witcher feels as if there is care and thought and time put into it, and that largely extends to the entire game. Another aspect of the story to touch upon would be the moral choices that you are presented with in the game. There is no morality system in that there are good choices and bad choices, but to some extent you have influence over the way Geralt will react, and there are large choices to make. Some of these decisions have far-reaching repercussions, others do not. Sometimes you are presented with a hard choice and no right answer. Do you allow an ancient, terrible spirit to roam the world again, if it might mean saving the lives of several children? Do you offer a dying woman a potion that might save her, or might cause her an even more painful death? There are many choices to make, and although only a few of them will play a role in determining your game's ending, it's about as much as anyone can expect from a game. It was certainly better than choosing one of 3 colours at the end of the game. At the end of this review, by the way, I'll touch upon what endings I got personally, if you're interested. So next up we have the world itself. Whilst it isn't particularly exciting to explore in that the world is full of amazing things to see, the content of the world comes a lot more from the writing. Well, how to put it? It is the opposite of Breath of the Wild. In Zelda, you might climb a hill and see an imposing, glowing structure in the distance. But once you get there, it is visually impressive, but hollow. That awesome looking castle on the cliff, it's basically just a reskinned cliff. There's nothing really interesting about it other than the way it looks. In The Witcher, you might find some boring, nasty ass looking cave that looks about as exciting as a puddle of water, but has some interesting stuff going on inside. You might find a letter that has some very interesting revelations in it. I imagine that is somewhat intentional, but I would have loved if the world had more exciting things to visit and see. I totally understand that it's supposed to be a somewhat realistic setting, but just look at the world we live in. It is full of natural and man-made wonders that look like they're out of a fantasy story. Still, that's a minor complaint. The world of Witcher 3 is large, split into several different open worlds. The game starts you in a small tutorial open world, but soon you move into the game's main open world, Velen. This is a large, stormy area, absolutely full of things to see, with about 2 large sort of town hubs and lots of small villages to explore. And then there's 2 smaller open world areas in addition to this, Kaer Morhen far to the north, and the Skellig Isles. The Skellig Isles are pretty much Skyrim. These areas feel distinct enough to one another, and I was genuinely impressed with their scale. When I got out of the tutorial area into the main area, I was like, wow, this is really big, and then there's 2 more areas to explore? Damn, that is very impressive. In addition, the Blood and Wine expansion adds a new open world area, the Sun-Kissed Duchy of Toussaint, far to the south, and this area is, I want to say smaller than Velen, but larger than the Skellig Isles, but I've not really compared them directly, but it's quite big all the same. And it makes a really nice break from the rest of the game. It's full of vibrant, rich colours and sunshine. It feels like going on a vacation after spending hundreds of hours in no man's land. The world is brought to life by the characters inhabiting it, and the weather effects that add to the atmosphere so well, and of course, the music. Many of the tracks in The Witcher 3 are based on folk songs, be they Scottish, Polish, Russian, whatever. The soundtrack is about everything you'd expect from a good video game score. There's rousing battle anthems, soft, ambient noises, and really nice sort of field music, for lack of a better term. That said, I think the game could have used more thematic pieces, a main theme that plays during important moments during the story, perhaps during the final boss fight as well. A very small nitpick, but largely because I can't think of a main theme that sticks in my head. And that's something I'm personally a very big fan of. I like having a single piece of music to identify and associate with a franchise. It has been hard to split the world, the visuals, the story into their own categories, as they all blend together so well in this game. Indeed, even the characters' facial animations and lip syncing are very well done for such a huge game. Some of the characters are able to express many emotions from very subtle movements of the eyes and mouth that really lend them a realistic touch without reaching into uncanny valley territory. That's really impressive. That's not to say the game is mind-blowing there, but it has some impressive moments. The best thing you can say about facial animation really is that you don't notice them when you're playing. It's the same thing with acting. You don't actually notice good acting when it's happening. That is the very definition of good acting. You don't realise that you are watching someone pretend that they are acting. That means they are coming across as natural, but when you go back and study it, you can respect how much emotion they managed to convey that you didn't even notice at the time consciously. It was conveyed to you. You realised the character was sad, but not in an on-the-nose way, as opposed to, say, Mass Effect Andromeda, where you immediately notice how dorky everyone looks, and having a tired face is no excuse. All that's left to cover before going into the DLC is gameplay. I've already touched on the combat and how it has a lot of room to improve, but what about the other aspects of gameplay? The user interface isn't terrible, but I think it could definitely be improved. Inventory management likewise, a lot of that could be streamlined. The item wheel should be expanded for starters, having more quest items on there. Sorting through hundreds of items you pick up can be a chore, and Witcher 3 does somewhat run into the open world problem of item hoarding. That is to say, when I enter a new area, my first instinct is to walk around the perimeter and hoover up everything that isn't nailed down. That shouldn't be how you approach an area in a video game, in my opinion. When you enter a dungeon, your focus should be on the dungeon. Where are the enemies? Where are the traps? Where is it safe? Where is it dangerous? Not activate Witcher senses, look for things that are glowing and run over to loot them, you know? So then I'm walking around with hundreds of junk items filling my bags. This is an impulse, but you never know what you might need. Personally, I don't like it. I don't like crafting systems that work that way. A very subjective complaint though, I realise. I prefer Dark Souls. I know that 99% of the items I pick up in Dark Souls have a use, and what that will be. Instead of picking up 100 items in a dungeon, it will probably be closer to 5 or 10 items, which does rather lead into loot in general. I don't think Witcher 3 handles loot all that well. Once you reach level 15 to 20, the game's loot largely just turns into find diagrams for Witcher gear and upgrade it. Feels somewhat uninvolved, as besides finding the diagram, that was all I really ever had to do. I think the game should have had fully randomized loot, or committed to the Witcher schools of gear and removed the randomized loot altogether. This hybrid system of both feels a little odd to me. Another option would be that you create your own gear, crafting it to suit your playstyle, deciding which benefits you get. That way you could have armor you like the look of, but also suits your playstyle. I also don't really understand the point in having so many different weapons when they're all effectively the same, plus they are leveled. So you might find the relic weapon Enduek Face Smasher at level 1 and then also at level 30. I'm not a huge fan of that. The weapons are also so damn hard to pronounce, but you know, that's entirely on me. But there's so many different weapons and they're all effectively the same, with very little variety in both appearance and playstyle. I think it would be nicer if they had far fewer swords, but made each one unique in some way, be it mechanically or otherwise. There are some weapons with unique mechanics. For example, in the Hearts of Stone DLC you can acquire a sword that has like a charge that builds up, and in Blood and Wine you can get a sword that builds charge by hitting enemies, and if the sword is fully charged and you kill an enemy, all the charge is spent to permanently increase the damage of the weapon. I think it would be nice to have more things like that, like have a sword that is specifically good at one thing, or just any sort of difference beyond numbers is very nice in my opinion. Again, the loot isn't exactly bad, but it's not something I enjoyed about the game either. When I really think hard on it, I do think Dark Souls has one of my favourite loot systems. I know that every weapon can be good if I upgrade it. I'm not going to replace my level 20 ultimate sword of laser shooting with a level 30 journeyman's ass hair shaver just because item level renders the lower level one obsolete. Perhaps The Witcher would benefit with taking some cues from such a system. Relic swords found at the start of the game shouldn't be useless at the end of the game, surely. They are still relics. These are supposed to be powerful weapons, so why does your character's level increasing make them useless? I don't like or understand that. That leaves just the two expansions to touch upon, Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine. Hearts of Stone perhaps has the more interesting story of the two, but it is also the far shorter and feature-sparse expansion. Taking place in the existing game world, I unfortunately do not know if it added new locations or not because I was playing the version of the game where it's already installed. I imagine it did add some new locations though. It tells a rather simple yet intriguing story that feels right out of a dark fairy tale. It is fairly short though. The second expansion, Blood and Wine, is the actual expansion. It feels like an expansion from the 90s or early 2000s. It adds a huge new area, loads of new quests, armor, weapons and so forth. Hell, they could have sold it as Witcher 4, if not Witcher 3 already being such a huge game. nobody would bat an eye. It is very rare in games to find something both huge and feature-rich, but The Witcher 3 managed it in the base game and in the expansion. Taking place in the Duchy of Tucson, you'll find plenty of vineyards and vampires, which has got to work, right? Blood and Wine also serves as a send-off to Geralt as a character, and it's a very fun send-off. Of course, despite the sunny locale, that doesn't mean there's no darker moments. Perhaps overall it has a somewhat lighter theme than the main game in Hearts of Stone, which is very dark, but there are a lot of things at stake. Get it? Stake? Because vampires? And there are some dark moments in it, certainly. If you had to pick just one, Blood and Wine is probably the one to go with. Hearts of Stone could be safely skipped, although it would improve your understanding of the world and certain themes in Blood and Wine. And Hearts of Stone is still good, don't get me wrong, the story is great. Both are honestly worth it in my opinion. And that about sums up The Witcher 3. There is very little to complain about from an objective standpoint. The game is huge and polished. The amount of time and care that has been put into every facet of it, genuinely impressive. And I'm rarely so impressed with the game's developers. So The Witcher 3 is certainly something I can suggest and recommend, if you haven't played it yet. I hope this review was helpful or entertaining. If you like this video, if you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon and get access to an exclusive members-only Discord server channel thing. Go check out Patreon, there's a link in the description. But before I go, I'm going to quickly touch on the endings I got in case anyone was curious. There are large spoilers here, so if you haven't played the game or are in the process of playing it, close out now. Still here? Alright then. The Bloody Baron lived and took his wife to attempt procurement of a cure for her. Kira survived, as did Lambert. Geralt romanced neither Yennefer nor Triss. I personally leaned more towards Triss. He ended the game travelling with Ciri as a Witcher. She survived the endgame. In Hearts of Stone, Geralt romanced Shani and stepped in to save Olgierd What's-His-Face from Gauntro Dim, banishing the latter. In Blood and Wine, Geralt unintentionally saved Cyanna from Dettlaff, killed Dettlaff, and, perhaps against his better judgment, persuaded Cyanna to forgive Henrietta. Ciri showed up at his vineyard, which he, naturally, fully upgraded. Would I have changed anything? Maybe romance Triss, but I wasn't really bothered by that. Wasn't a fan of Cyanna, or in particular Henrietta. Perhaps she deserved to be killed by Dettlaff, but at the end of the day, perhaps it's better to live and make up for your mistakes. Felt a little sorry for Dettlaff. He was a very strange, sorry character, I think. That said, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.